Begin. My name is John Minns. I'm from the Refugee Action Campaign in Canberra, and I'll be your MC for this evening. Firstly, people will be on this meeting from outside Canberra, but wherever you are in Australia, you are on Aboriginal land. I'm in the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. The title of this meeting is Islamophobia and Refugees. And the prejudice behind the policy is what we're going to be looking at in the course of the meeting. When we look back at these policies, the uniquely cruel policies which this government and successive governments have adopted towards people seeking asylum and refugees, we're compelled to ask why. And why have so many Australians supported those policies? Certainly, there's been a competitive situation between the major parties that's led to a race to show that each could be tougher than the other on refugees. And so the policy has become worse and worse. But that begs the question, why were these policies accepted in the first place? Since 1788, racism has been a significant part of Australian society towards Indigenous people, towards initially the Chinese, and then towards all people of colour. And while there have been extraordinary successes in calling out and defeating racism, it's still possible through fear, I believe, to mobilise it for political purposes. One of the latest forms of racism is Islamophobia. Sometimes we see Australian politicians weaponising it in a barely concealed way. An example I remember is when Tony Abbott made his infamous speech in London warning that Europe must adopt Australia's refugee policies, or else, to use his words, Europe will be changed forever. Well, changed how, Tony? He knew what he meant, and so did his audience. Never one for even that degree of subtlety, Peter Dutton simply said it was a mistake to accept Lebanese Muslims in the 1970s. So tonight we're going to discuss these questions, and we have two terrific speakers, Senator Mehreen Faruqi and Jeff Sparrow. Before I introduce them, I'll just let you know how we're going to run the meeting. So we'll be recording the meeting so that those who couldn't be here tonight can listen. Each of the speakers will speak for about 15 minutes. Then we'll have a period in which you can ask questions of the speakers. We'll be doing this through the chat function. If you haven't done this before, you can enable the chat function at the bottom of your screen. If chat doesn't appear in that menu at the bottom, you can click on more, and under that will be chat. Then you'll see what everyone is writing as questions. Please be aware that everyone will see what you write, and so keep it polite and respectful. I'll try to summarize the questions as best I can and put them to the speakers. I won't be able to get to all of the questions, but I'll do my best. Periodically, we'll put up details of how to sign up to the campaign. If you're not in Canberra, you can email us and we'll put you in touch with a group local to you. So firstly, Senator Mehreen Faruqi is the Greens Senator for New South Wales. She has a Master of Engineering Science and a doctorate in Environmental Engineering. She was named one of Australia's most influential engineers and has had a distinguished career in that field and in academia before entering Parliament. But when she did join the New South Wales State Parliament in the Upper House in 2013, she was the first Muslim woman to sit in any Australian Parliament. 2 years ago, Mehreen became Australia's first Muslim senator. She's been a fierce advocate against racism and misogyny, and we're honoured to have her with us tonight. Thank you, Mehreen.
Thank you so much, John, and hello, everyone. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are zooming from and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I am on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. We all know that sovereignty to this land was never ceded. This land is, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. And I think it's important also to recognize that there can be no environmental or social justice without racial justice. And that means working alongside First Nations people for treaties, for their right to self-determination, and for justice. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this forum. It's a real privilege to be here with all of you. I mean, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, not only because I have firsthand experience of racism and Islamophobia, sadly, like many others who live here, but because this is also one of the issues that drew me to political activism in Australia, and to the Greens as well. And while speaking tonight, I will be reflecting on some of my personal experiences, but I do this with the full knowledge that there are many others in society who are subjected to much worse, and this must change. So for me, the reality these days is that not a day goes by that I don't get a message of hate telling me to piss off, to F off, telling me that I don't belong here, and much more violent stuff that I won't or I don't think I can repeat here. This comes through many channels: social media, traditional media, through phone calls to my office, through letters, sometimes even handwritten letters, and face-to-face as well. And so to me, it seems that, some can bear my existence or our existence as long as we keep our head down and we be grateful for what we have. When we dare to call out Islamophobia, racism, race baiting, or centuries of oppression, we are told that we have a victim mentality, or we're a whinging lefty, or that we are attention seeking. And this is part and parcel of the systematic silencing that people of color know very well. And for years, I ignored this overt and covert racism and xenophobia that was sent my way or my family's way, thinking that probably I'm doing something wrong, or people are just ignorant, that they don't know, and that education will fix everything. And also, I guess I didn't want to put yet another notch in my troublemaker reputation. But a few years ago, things changed for me, and the level of hatred and toxicity that was being sent my way reached new heights, and I decided to out this. And I started expressing the view that increasing racism and stoking the fires of hate must be taken seriously. Well, that sure did open up the floodgates of even more hate and abuse. And I've since endured an endless stream of racist, offensive communications. I've been told that white Australia is the real victim here, not a whinging Muslim. People have even called my office to harass my staff, to demand to know how many Anzac Day dawn services I have attended, and much more. When I migrated to Australia from Pakistan in 1992, I must say I did feel welcome. While we did experience what is called everyday racism or casual racism, there definitely wasn't the searing heat of hate that exists now. And as a newcomer, my initial assessment was that Australians had worked hard for an egalitarian society. But the more you find out about our history of colonialism, the more you realize how far away from reality that is for Indigenous Australians. The reality is tainted with dispossession, occupation, and bloody violence. It is also an undeniable fact that since then, for over 2 centuries, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been targeted by the worst kind of oppression, discrimination, and racism through government policies. Asylum seekers have also for decades now borne the brunt of cruel and inhumane government policies, aiming at deterring, detaining, and deporting vulnerable people, resulting in unimaginable damage to thousands of people, including women and children. And while discrimination and racism isn't new to Australia, what has changed is the blatant legitimization, normalization, and even encouragement at many levels of politics and in the media. In Australia, some politicians and some in the media have played a key role in inciting the Islamophobia and hate that ferments right-wing extremism. For years, we have watched politicians whip up anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant hysteria. For years, we have warned of the impact it has on our community. For years, we have spoken out about the damage this causes and the succor it gives to white nationalists that want to kick all non-white people out of Australia. Now, in my first speech to the Senate, exactly 2 years ago tomorrow, in fact, I lamented that political leaders, in addition to their old habit of racist dog whistling, are now quite comfortable outright fanning the flames of racial conflict. They can't shrug off their role in creating a climate of hate and racism. And sadly, this hasn't changed in the last couple of years I've been there. In our parliament, there have been despicable calls for a return to white Australia and a ban on Muslim migration. We've been told that Australia is being swamped by Muslims, and there have been calls for a burqa ban. And these views aren't contained to some imagined fringe of our parliament. In fact, many senior politicians have quietly stood by and allowed this to happen, tacitly approving or simply not caring enough to speak up. And I thought of these bystanding politicians when reading a piece in The Guardian by Gary Young. He wrote, "Racism can't be met halfway any more than you can remove half a cancer and expect it not to grow back. Attempts to triangulate with weasel words about the legitimate concerns of traditional voters are dishonest." And I must say others have done much worse than triangulate and dog whistle. The Liberal and National government voted as a bloc to support One Nation's "It's Okay to be White" motion. As John said earlier, we can't forget Government Minister Peter Dutton suggesting there was a mistake to let Lebanese Muslims into Australia, or the 2011 reports that Scott Morrison, then Immigration Minister, now of course Prime Minister, urged the shadow cabinet to capitalize on concerns about Muslim immigration as an electoral tactic. And this has resulted in increasing negative attitudes towards Muslims in Australia, which is clearly shown by social surveys conducted in the last few years. While not all asylum seekers are Muslims, they are often racialized or seen as Muslim, and Islamophobic prejudice immediately extends to asylum seekers. Linking the war on terror and refugees further serve the purpose of political parties and politicians to strengthen their narrative of stopping asylum seekers from coming to Australia in the first place. In 2001, the then Prime Minister John Howard famously, or should I say shamefully, said, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come." This culminated in the Tampa affair, which you could say was one of the most divisive federal election campaigns in Australia. This was also the first time I considered joining a political party. And for me, the Greens were the obvious choice. While both Liberals and Labour were busily creating panic and demonizing desperate asylum seekers, claiming that asylum seekers had thrown their children overboard, the voice of Bob Brown rose above this rabble. When innocent asylum seekers were maligned by the Howard government, also supported by the Beazley opposition, the Greens were the only voice of humanity speaking out to bring innocent asylum seekers here. Soon after that, Green Senators Bob Brown and Kerry Nettle heckled George Bush in Parliament as he spun his lies about the war in Iraq. They got kicked out of the chamber, and I got inspired to join the Greens. From then to now, asylum seekers have been increasingly demonized and dehumanized. Asylum seeker policies have become more and more cruel, restrictive, punitive, and militarized. And spin over substance became the mantra. Asylum seekers were maligned by how they are described: queue jumpers, boat people, illegals, rotters, criminal aliens, economic refugees, threats to national security. And this inflammatory language is used deliberately to create fear and division. They were painted as people very different to mainstream Australia. They are from a different culture, we were told. They are not one of us. Politicians said, "We don't want people like that in Australia. These boat people throw their children into the ocean," and so continued the othering of people just like us. Asylum seekers have now seen decades of bipartisan cruelty in the form of TPVs, mandatory detention, offshore processing, being locked up in hotels during the pandemic. They've been hidden away with no access to journalists. Losing all hope, and in desperation, they've harmed themselves and committed suicide. They've been sexually assaulted. They've died because they didn't get medical attention. The same systemic racism that has played out so viciously for First Nations peoples has resulted in prejudice against Muslims and immigrants and the mistreatment of refugees. In 2016, 4 senators were elected to Parliament on the back of anti-asylum seeker and anti-immigration policies. Some were re-elected in 2019, and One Nation has continued to elect members at the state government level. Yet racism is trivialized and denied in Australia. With the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, while the world is trying to find ways to dismantle institutional racism, their symbols of imperialism are being removed, police reform is taking place. But here in our country, we're still stuck on whether the protests should have happened at all. Rather than acknowledging the truth about history, invasion, and colonization, the government here is vilifying people who attended those rallies. And our Prime Minister Scott Morrison says there was no slavery in Australia. After Christchurch, that horrendous, horrific attack where so many people were killed in a mosque, while Muslims were showered with love by many, we have also been bombarded with extraordinary hate and filth. When we once again called out the climate of hate and racism contributing to such violence, we were questioned, we were attacked, we were constantly asked for proof. When we report threats to the federal police, we're told that they're just other people's point of view and that I should expect that as a federal senator. I was told by media that race-baiting comments by politicians are just part and parcel in the rough and tumble of politics. News Limited's Australian paper said I was pursuing a spotlight moment of political narc and incendiary slogan bombing by simply telling the truth. We are told we are hijacking public debate with our call-outs of racism. You know, we're often told as a community, as a public, that asylum seeker policies are not racist. And this is then justified by claims that it is fair, impartial, and common sense policy. Shouldn't those who have been patiently waiting for their turn in a queue be priority rather than those jumping the queue? Or shouldn't we protect our national identity and Australian culture from those who are very different? So of course, asylum seeker policies are not racist. This is such a twisted, self-serving conception of racism, very deliberate and very galling, I might add. Too often racism can be dismissed also as coming from a place of hardship. But when you piece together evidence such as Australian flag capes, the ridiculous halal certification hysteria, and the pervasive references to our Judeo-Christian foundation, the real agenda emerges, marginalizing Australians who fall outside a very narrow conception of what it is to be one of us. As someone much cleverer than me has said, denial is the heartbeat of racism. And that is exactly what is happening here. But it doesn't have to be this way. But to change that, more of us have to stand up and speak out. I think this is a moment in time which we have to seize with both hands to demand racial justice and to end systemic racism once and for all. And we must be unapologetic about it. This week, there has been a lot written about the whitewashing on the box. That is about the lack of diversity in Australian TV and media, both on screen and in the editorial rooms and in leadership positions. And this same lack of diversity spreads throughout politics, parliaments, and workplaces. Our parliament isn't even close to representing the streets and suburbs of our country. But you know what? We should also take responsibility for changing that. No one is going to roll out a red carpet for us. We need to roll up our sleeves and get to work. We must have our say. We are part and parcel of democracy. We must speak up and get active on issues that matter to us. There are politicians in our parliaments who don't want asylum seekers or migrants who look like me to come here because we don't fit their description of what Australians should be like. Meanwhile, a few years ago, the government spent $10 million on a launch in London to attract Irish, French, German, and Italian working holiday makers. Apparently, these are the right type of people to bring to Australia. I'll end with the wonderful Angela Davis, who says, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So now is the time to become an ally and anti-racist. We can't change history, but we can make things right now and for the future. So let's move forward, viewing this history with eyes wide open.
Thanks very much, Mehreen. That was very, very interesting. And I think the point that you made in particular about the way in which the refugee has been linked to the person, the Muslim, and also to the terrorist, has been a very powerful construction for the right in politics in Europe and in Australia and in elsewhere. The fact that none of that is true, none of that is rational or makes sense, really is the point here. It's been a very powerful political move for them. Let me move on to our second speaker, Jeff Sparrow. Jeff has become an important commentator and critic in Australian politics. He holds a PhD in creative media and has now built up a very impressive list of publications. I've known Jeff for a very long time, and over a while now, I've been following his career from afar, and it seems like he's producing just about a new book every year the last few years, such as 3 years ago, No Way But This, In Search of Paul Robeson. 2 years ago, Trigger Warnings, Political Correctness and the Rise of the Right. And particularly relevant to tonight's discussion, Fascists Among Us, Online Hate and the Christchurch Massacre. He is a Walkley Award-winning author, a former editor of the literary journal Overland, and a frequent contributor to many press outlets, including The Guardian, The Conversation, Crikey, The Age, and others. Thanks very much, Jeff, for being with us.
Thanks, John, for that lovely introduction. So, on the 15th of March 2019, an Australian man walked into 2 mosques in Christchurch and killed 51 people and wounded 49 others. And that man will be facing sentence in a week's time. As John mentioned, I wrote a little book about the Christchurch massacre. And in the course of that book, I had to do a lot of thinking about Islamophobia and its relationship to fascism. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Not because I think that every Islamophobe is a fascist, but because I'm convinced, after researching the terrible events in Christchurch a little over a year ago, that Islamophobia is central to the emergence of a new kind of fascism, both in Australia and around the world. And one of the reasons I wrote that book is because I wanted to talk about what fascism actually means. And it's a subject about which a lot of people don't really want to discuss, because they think of fascism as simply a boo word, a term that you could apply to anyone who's to the right of the Liberal Party, and as such, not really very meaningful in any serious sense. But of course, the perpetrator of the Christchurch massacre said explicitly in his manifesto that he described himself as a fascist. I am a fascist, he said explicitly in the manifesto. And he made it very clear that by that, he didn't simply mean that he was on the right, but he belonged to a particular political and historical tradition. And if we want to understand that political tradition, we have to look at history. Interestingly, the perpetrator of the massacre said that the person who influenced him most wasn't Adolf Hitler or Mussolini, although he clearly admired both of them, but the leader of the British Union of Fascists, a man called Oswald Mosley. And I think that's quite significant, because it reminds us that fascism wasn't simply a German or Italian phenomenon, but rather something that at various times has manifested all around the world, including in England, where in the 1930s, it had for a brief period of time a sizable presence. So what then is this phenomenon of fascism? It's a difficult question to answer, but I think we can say that fascism has at least 2 key components. And these components help to distinguish it from other right-wing ideas. One of the paradoxes of fascism is, while many conservative ideas are hostile to social equality and want to see a hierarchical society constructed, fascism simultaneously presents itself as being a radical program, a program of tearing down society and implementing some kind of revolutionary process. So how does it manage to overcome this strange contradiction between being both reactionary and radical? Well, I think there are 2 elements. One is a fixation on violence, and violence as a redemptive force, both for individuals and for societies. It's through violence that fascists sees both countries and people being transformed and in some way redeemed. And secondly, and more importantly for this discussion, racism has always been central to fascism. And if you think about the example of Nazi Germany, you can see how that works. If you think of, say, a stormtrooper in Berlin in the 1930s, he could go into a Jewish ghetto and harass some of the poorest people in that country, but the ideology of anti-Semitism allowed him to present that as an attack on power, an attack on the elders of Zion who apparently controlled the entire world. And so racism and anti-Semitism in particular helps fascism to overcome its central contradictions. And it's interesting to talk about Mosley because, of course, unlike Hitler and Mussolini, Mosley survived the Second World War and then in the 1940s and 1950s tried to rebuild a fascist organisation. But he didn't have much success. And I think that's for a couple of important reasons. Specifically, after the Second World War, fascism was so discredited because its violence was so apparent during the Second World War. And secondly, in the 1940s, anti-Semitism was widely discredited. In the 1920s and the 1930s, anti-Semitism was part of mainstream public discourse. By the 1940s, while there was still widespread anti-Semitism, it was increasingly not a language that one could use in mainstream discourse. Throughout the 20th century, one of the reasons why fascists remain a marginal presence in the English-speaking world was anti-Semitism was rightly marginalised. If somebody used an anti-Semitic terms or engaged in anti-Semitic discourse in the public realm, they were rightly shunned. And that made things very, very difficult for fascists. In the 21st century, something changed and changed very dramatically in ways that I think are very important to this meeting. One of those changes was to do with the direct effects of 9/11 and the war on terror and the sudden new discourse that emerged around borders, around security, around refugees, around suspicion of the foreign, around the permanent wars that were embarked upon. But alongside that, and I would suggest in some ways more important than that, was the emergence or the mainstreaming of Islamophobia. And why I think that was so important was because the Islamophobia that entered the mainstream of Australian society from 2001 and grew very quickly thereafter replicated all of the essential elements of the old anti-Semitism of the 1920s and the 1930s. So you think of the classic trope of the anti-Semite. The Jew is sinister, the Jew is foreign, the Jew wears strange clothes, the Jew has a strange religion, the Jew eats peculiar food and worships a strange god. And in particular, the Jew is linked simultaneously to criminality and to political violence. All of those tropes were replicated almost word for word in Islamophobia. And what's more, while by 2001, anti-Semitism had been thankfully driven by and large out of the mainstream discourse, Islamophobia was impeccably mainstream. So in that time, if one had got up at a public meeting or in a newspaper column and written an article regurgitating anti-Semitic tropes, one would be driven out of public life. If one in 2001 made the same speech but substituted the anti-Semitic terms for Islamophobic terms, you would not be driven out of public life. Instead, you would be offered a spot on Sky News or a column in the Herald Sun or the Telegraph. And this made a tremendous difference because the centrality of the old anti-Semitism to the far right and in particular to the fascist right was now replicated by this resurgence of, by this new discourse of Islamophobia. And again, I want to stress not every Islamophobe who emerged in the 2000s was an explicit fascist. In fact, in some ways, the perpetrator of the Christchurch massacre saw the massacre as a way of distinguishing himself from those that we might call right-wing populists, who, while they shared his Islamophobia, did not share his commitment to redemptive violence. So there was a clear difference, and he saw a clear difference between fascism and right-wing populism. At the same time, he also made it clear that Islamophobia made the kind of beliefs that he wanted to proselytize far more mainstream. And interestingly, the atrocity in Christchurch has now been replicated numerous times around the world by gunmen who explicitly tried to imitate the perpetrator of that atrocity and published manifestos where they praised him and his deeds. One of those atrocities involved an attack on a mosque. Another one involves an attack on Mexicans. The Christchurch perpetrator, however, said very, very clearly that he targeted the Muslim community in Christchurch and the two mosques that he attacked. He targeted them because he thought that those attacks would be the most popular. He said explicitly, I could have targeted other groups, but I targeted these people because Muslims are so hated and Islamophobic. Islamophobia is so mainstream. Now, by distinguishing between genuine fascists and right-wing populists, we should by no means allow the latter to get off the hook. The mainstream Islamophobes might not be committed to the redemptive violence of fascists, but that's by and large because they are committed to actions by the Australian state, which involve implicit coercion, that manifests in ways that we all know too well, from boat turnbacks to indefinite detention, from the grinding cruelty of Australia's Gulag archipelago. Nevertheless, I think we should also say that Islamophobia creates the sea in which the fish of genuine fascism swim. And that is something that I think we need to take very, very seriously, because, as I said, the Christchurch massacre happened in 2019. It has been imitated all around the world. It was explicitly designed to be imitated. And I think we can be quite confident that there will be other imitators who have yet not manifested itself. So opposition to Islamophobia, I think, is tremendously important. It's a cause that has the same kind of moral force, or should have the same kind of moral force, as opposition to anti-Semitism had in the 1920s and the 1930s, and still has today. And that's why it's great that the Refugee Action Collective has organised this meeting, and it's fantastic to see so many people here to discuss this important topic, even if it's in the sort of ersatz forum of Zoom. I think it's tremendously important that we take a stand on this issue, because I think if we don't, we can be confident that the suffering we're all concerned about will continue to happen, and we may see episodes of further atrocities like we saw in Christchurch. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I think it's really interesting the points that you make about the way in which Islamophobia has taken over and occupied almost exactly the same space as anti-Semitism in the 20s and 30s. It's interesting though as well, I've done a little bit of reading about attitudes and polls taken in Europe, for example, and there's a very close correlation between Islamophobia and a rising anti-Semitism. That the ability to find a scapegoat is national. And in fact, the three groups that top the people who are most opposed, most reviled, now Muslims, Jews, and the Roma. In all of these cases, they're seen as outsiders, they're seen as powerful and criminals and of a different culture and so on. So I think perhaps anti-Semitism is on its way back. Now, I've been trying to collect together questions from the chat, and please feel free to write in questions, and I'll try to summarize them or to bring them together as much as possible. A couple of people have asked questions of the speakers, and either speaker or both, feel free to respond to this. There are a couple of questions which are about Islam itself and the way in which the right and Islamophobes like Corey Bernardi and Pauline Hanson say that Islam is not a religion, but an extremist political ideology. And linked to that, why is it that Islam has been chosen as the religion to be particularly afraid of rather than other minority religions? Jeff or Mehreen?
Okay, well, I'll have a go on that. A go at that. I mean, it is. Have I muted myself? God, I hate.
No, you're right.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, you can go back and look at the text from Pauline Hanson's maiden speech. And of course, in that speech, it's entirely directed at Asians. So she says that Asians, are going to take over Australia, and there's not a single mention of Muslims in the entire speech. Whereas if you look at One Nation's platform now, there is barely a mention of Asians. So the rhetoric has entirely shifted, and in fact, in many respects, that the bigots now are referring to the same people, but with a different kind of rhetoric. So in the old days, they would have been, in Pauline Hanson's first incarnation, they would have been berating people for being Asians, and now they are berating the same people for being Muslims. In terms of the argument that every bigot comes up with, that, well, I can't be a racist because Islam is not a race. Well, I mean, it's the comparison to anti-Semitism there is very, very instructive. I mean, the problem is with that argument is, of course, in order to make that argument, you have to define what a race is. And as soon as you start getting into definitions about what a race is, you get into the language of biological racism in and of itself. Because, of course, races are created by racists. There is no biological meaning to the notion of race. So when you start talking about who belongs to a race and who doesn't belong to a race, you immediately find yourself entering into a whole sort of racist discourse about, nose measuring and hair color and all that sort of stuff. Well, in fact, everyone who sees Islamophobia in action knows exactly what it means for you. So you see those videos where some Islamophobe gets up on a bus and starts berating, people for being Muslims or whatever. Actually, when you see it in action, the structure of it is absolutely identical to old school biological racism. And what's more, everybody knows it. And so it seems to me that argument that one can't be a racist because Islam is not a race is simply a bad faith argument. Nobody actually thinks it. People just think it's a cute debating trick.
John, I might have a go as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll premise this by saying that I'm not a scholar of Islam, but, Islam is a religion that is practiced by millions of people in the world. It's an Abrahamic religion like Christianity and Judaism. That's just a basic fact, right? So for them to say that it is an extremist political ideology is obviously willful misrepresentation of what Islam is, and it's for their own political agenda to smear all Muslims. And I guess what Jeff said earlier as well, it's easy to create fear of people who look different, maybe eat differently to you, wear clothes that are, kind of not in the mainstream. So it's always easy to make those people targets. And a lot of this is also about scapegoating, like Pauline Hanson or Cory Bernardi don't have solutions for the big problems we face today. So it's very easy to blame and create fear and division of people who might seem different to who you are. We're not getting jobs because these migrants, are coming from other places to take up our jobs. So I think some politicians even went as far as to say we have congestion problems with traffic because of all these migrants. So it's very easy to do that. And those problems are there. And they connect somehow with people who don't think deeper than that.
Thanks, Mehreen. Another question that's come through on the chat is about the decline of anti-Semitism. Is this simply a question of the bad taste left by the bad odor about anti-Semitism that was created by the Second World War? Were there other cultural changes which brought about a decline in anti-Semitism? And I suspect the question is kind of asking, is there a way that we could employ similar methods to fight Islamophobia?
Yeah, it's really good and interesting question. I think the short answer is it's a bit of both. Clearly, the Holocaust discredited Nazi ideas and Nazi racism. But I said before that after the Second World War, Mosley tried to make a comeback in Britain and was unsuccessful. But he was briefly quite successful. In the late 40s, it did actually look like Mosley was going to rebuild an organization around anti-Semitism in post-war austerity. And the reason why he wasn't ultimately successful was because people mobilized against him in great numbers. And, there's really interesting account of Jewish ex-service people in particular would regularly track down everywhere that the Mosleyites were having their meetings, and they would heckle them and they would disrupt them, and they made these people pariahs I think in a way that we need to do with the Islamophobes today. And I think in some respects it relates to the previous question as well. One of the difficulties with fighting Islamophobia today is, of course, one of the generators of Islamophobia is the ongoing wars in the Middle East. Well, in the ongoing war on terror, of course, it's no coincidence that the big spur of Islamophobia comes after 9/11 and the ongoing war on terror. So we have this transformation of, say, the transformation of the way that people in America thought about Afghanistan from, that the Mujahideen were our anti-communist allies, to these are these sort of terrible people with whom we're engaged in a clash of civilization. So I think that so long as these wars continue to continue to exist, they will continue to foster Islamophobia.
Mehreen, did you want to add anything?
No, I think Jeff has pretty much said it all.
Okay, terrific. I've got a question about Australian policy, and in particular the cruelty that seems to be unnecessary, even from the point of view of the policymakers themselves. There are so many examples of this. The fact that the Priya and Nadesh, the Tamil family, who were appealing the right to stay in Australia from Biloela, while this process is going on, they have to be held in Christmas Island in a detention centre all by themselves, and they're about to send actual criminals there. Why is this? Is this just an unnecessary cruelty, or is it something that's now been built into the system, do you think?
Well, the whole way we treat asylum seekers is unnecessary cruelty, if you ask me, from the start till the end. But, both major political parties have found that politically expedient for themselves. In over 2 decades, they've created this narrative. And I mean, they do it to be popular. I mean, they're doing it to grab those votes that would go to Pauline Hanson and the extreme right parties. And that's the frustrating thing about it. It's, you know, it's designed to win elections in many ways. And I noticed there was a question about the Labour Party as well, and why doesn't the Labour Party, you know, do something different? Well, they don't, because firstly, they don't have the guts to stand up. And I think in my time in Australia, what I've seen is that politicians and political parties, you know, are following votes rather than showing leadership and, you know, doing the right thing and trying to change people's minds about these issues of racism and Islamophobia, and, you know, refugees and asylum seekers have to be stopped because they're terrible people. They're different to us, and we don't know whether they're legitimate or, you know, legal. Rather than changing people's minds and doing that hard work, they are just fostering more and more hate and cruelty. I mean, at some level, it is really difficult to understand. But when you look at the history of the last 2 decades, especially, you understand, you know, that the reason this is happening is because we are still a country, it seems, bound by white Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tremendous paradox around this. I think one of the reasons that both major parties concentrate so much time and energy on and cruelty around border policy is precisely because the borders were never in crisis, and that because this is not a major issue. They don't focus on it because it is a major issue. They focus on it because it's not. And what I mean by that is, if you look at opinion polling consistently, when people are asked what are the most important issues for your vote, the issues that they will say are housing, the issues they will say are education, they will talk about health, and generally, and this is a consistent, you can go back and have a look at the data, this is a consistent and robust statistics over a long period of time. Very few people nominate border security as the most important subject for them. But on the other hand, if you're a politician, actually doing something about education, doing something about health, doing something about the crowded roads in Sydney, these are all difficult things to do. But monstering refugees is not difficult, precisely because it's not a crisis, because the numbers of people coming to Australia are so small and were always so small, it wasn't a particularly difficult thing to do. And I think that's part of a reason for the cruelty, because the crueler you can be to refugees, the more you can show that you are doing something. So you can't do something about education, but you can show that you're taking phones away from refugees. And I think what happens is then, like, if you look at, I'm not trying to suggest that Australians are innately anti-racist or anything like that, because that's not necessarily true. And actually you can show studies that show that people approve of some of these acts of cruelty. But I think there is a tremendous displacement going on where, you know, like, actually what people in the inner west of Sydney want is, they want, you know, their streets not to be so crowded, and they want their facilities to be much, much better. But they also think they're not going to get them. And if they're not going to get them, the government is going to make someone else suffer. And that's better than nothing. If you see what I mean? So it's a displacement of real issues onto other issues. And I think that that spurs this incredibly petty and vicious cruelty, because it's something that they can seem to be doing something.
I think that's right. I think that's right, Jeff. But I think there's possibly another dimension to this as well. That this has now been happening for a very long time, and I think the structure of the system, border force, immigration department, and so on, the people inside there, the incentives are all to be as tough as possible. And the slightest weakness, the slightest generosity, the slightest element of humanity is going to be punished for those people rather than rewarded. We had the author of a book called Seeking Asylum by Boat, an historian called Claire Higgins, recently speak for us. And just to see how far things have come, the cover of that book has a customs officer in uniform holding and comforting a small Vietnamese child who'd come by boat and arrived in Darwin. And throughout the book, there are lots of instances of people, including senior officials, head of immigration, etc., explicitly rejecting policies projected to them on the grounds of cruelty. That's not going to happen today. I think it's very largely for the reasons that Jeff said, that cruelty is politically rewarded. You're doing something and displacing other issues that you can't do anything about. But I think it's now become a fundamental part of the structure. And, you know, the bureaucrats, even at relatively low levels now, I think have become part of that culture. I have a couple of other questions already. One is about the impact of COVID on the refugee issue. And on the one hand, Leo says the closure of borders might tend to reinforce nationalist tendencies, isolationist tendencies, keep people out, etc. On the other hand, is the possibility that COVID might create a sense of we are all in this together, and therefore a sense of solidarity. Any views?
Well, I think for our current government, that actually hasn't created a sense of we are all in this together. While they keep saying it over and over, we're definitely not all in this together. Just look at who missed out on financial economic support, JobKeeper, job seeker when the pandemic hit. It was temporary visa holders, it was casual workers, it was international students. Those are people that mostly look like me, I have to say. So sadly, that hasn't happened. And I think it is, from the government's perspective, it has brought out more and more nationalistic tendencies. We also saw, you know, the initial racism that, you know, kind of came to the fore against Chinese Australians as well. And people calling the pandemic the China virus. So I think, again, you know, people who would use it for their political agenda have used it for their political agenda. Within the community, I must say, especially on the issue, because that was something that, you know, I worked on quite a lot, international students, there is, I think, a lot of solidarity and support. Within the community, there is a lot of solidarity and support as well for refugees and what's happening to them, and the, you know, the recent moves to take away their phones again, which used to be the case years ago when they weren't allowed phones. But I think that the challenge for us is how to consolidate that sentiment, how to bring that sentiment to the fore so that it actually has an impact on policy, and it has an impact on how decisions are made and how those decisions are changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting and difficult question. I pretty much agree with Mehreen that, you know, you only have to look at the difference. I'm in Melbourne, so, you know, I haven't been outside the house for weeks now. And you only have to look at the difference between the way people on cruise ships get treated compared to the way people in housing commission buildings in Melbourne get treated, to see the way that the pandemic has highlighted every fault line in society, with people who are economically insecure or racially oppressed suffering the brunt of it again and again. I also think that we are yet to really understand what the consequences have been, what the consequences will be of the tremendous state powers that the various governments are getting as the result of this crisis. I mean, in Victoria, for instance, the police now have extraordinary powers, you know, and perhaps that's warranted in the context of a pandemic, but, you know, how that's going to play out in the future, who knows? I would just say, however, on the flip side of that, we are living through an extraordinary time at the moment. I mean, 2020 is going to be seen as one of the turning points in world history, and how exactly the current instability is going to play out remains completely unseen. So, you know, we're heading towards depression era unemployment. You know, we haven't even started the bushfire season yet, but all of the manifestations of climate change that we saw last year, none of them have gone away. So, you know, if we're going to be optimistic, I think that the instability that is so much a part of the world system at the moment, I think opens up all sorts of possibilities that previously didn't exist. You only have to think of the extraordinary state spending that's been devoted to responding to COVID, which suddenly makes arguments that we can't afford to act on climate change just seem totally ridiculous. So, you know, perhaps out of this instability, something good may come if one wanted to be a glass half full kind of person.
Thanks, Jeff and Mehreen. There are a couple of other questions that we might perhaps finish up on, and I'm sorry again if I haven't been able to summarize all of the questions that have come through on the chat, but we probably need to finish up before too long. The first of the questions is about the media. Why is the media, or most of it, being so consistently bad on this question?
On the question of Islamophobia?
Islamophobia and refugees, sorry.
Yeah. I guess one of the biggest problems we have in Australian media is, or two big problems, I guess both related to diversity. I mean, in terms of, firstly, like the number of media outlets we have, controlled by a couple of people. That's a problem, firstly. And secondly, which has been talked about a lot, is media diversity. I guess going back a step, the media talks about this issue in the same way, I guess, as the two major parties. It's the same kind of rhetoric, and I think it comes from the same place. But I think what really feeds and what really kind of helps them get away with that is the real lack of diversity in the media. It is shocking. The stories of refugees, the stories of immigrants, they don't come out because those people are just not there. And it's the same situation in our parliaments. Those stories never come out, are never given priority because those people are just not there. And I think for a country like ours, which is so rich in terms of the number of people and the number of countries they come from, the languages they speak, it is just it is shocking to see how little voice they have. But again, it's you know, how do you change that? I know that coming here as a migrant, the last thing on your mind is to be politically active on anything. It takes like years upon years to settle in. And that's, again, something that has been happening over time, like the support for immigrants, the support for refugees to settle in, to get a job, to find a house, that has been reducing drastically over time. And you know, that makes a huge difference of how we can participate in media, in society, in politics, in anything. And things will not change unless that changes.
Yeah, look, I mean, on that, I think we've seen this movie before. I mean, I talked in my remarks about the rise of Sir Oswald Mosley in the 1930s. Well, Mosley's greatest success with his British Union of Fascists, or to give them their later name, the British Union of Fascists and National Socialists, their greatest peak was when they had the public support of the Daily Mail, one of the biggest tabloid papers of the time, which ran front pages, hurrah for the black shirts. Why did they do this? Well, they did this because the media is big business. It's owned by tremendously wealthy, mostly men who have the kind of interest that you would expect people like that to have, one of which is ferocious hatred of social justice and the left, and thus, you know, an ongoing concern to find scapegoats, as well as on a more prosaic level to sell papers. To get good ratings, and, you know, monstering minorities is a pretty good way of doing both of those things. And so, you know, like, I think we can expect that most of the media, most of the time, is not going to be on our side on these issues. Great,
thanks. I'm just going to end perhaps with one last question, which is perhaps the most important of all. It, I guess, combines a couple of questions that have come through in the chat. One is from Anna, who says, if you call someone a racist or you call a politician a racist, it's taken as a terrible personal affront and, I guess, kind of bad manners, almost. But it's linked to the other big question, which is, how do we fight Islamophobia? What's the strategy for fighting Islamophobia and defeating it? We only ask simple questions here.
Yes. I think fighting Islamophobia is like fighting racism, really. How do we fight racism? And, you know, from my perspective, we really have to be quite unapologetic about fighting it. And, you know, I've often talked about us becoming anti-racists. And becoming an anti-racist means many things. It means at every opportunity, if you have the capacity, like, to call it out, that's kind of the first step. We can't let people who are spouting racism and hate kind of get away with it scot-free without even highlighting it. So I think that's kind of the first step. And for me, then, you know, often my white friends have asked me, you know, how they can become allies. And of course, you can become allies because you are still here in quite a big majority in Australia. And there's a number of ways of becoming allies. But for me, the most powerful way of becoming allies is to stand aside and give your spot to a Muslim person if you're fighting Islamophobia. Let them speak, but for themselves and by themselves, really. You know, step aside to provide an opportunity for, you know, a person of color to be able to, you know, I don't know, run for parliament, for instance, you know, be at the forefront of the climate justice movement. There's a big criticism of, you know, the climate movement where it's not at all diverse or intersectional. And that is absolutely true. So those spaces will only be made when other people step aside. And also, I guess the last thing I would say is listen. Speak less, listen more. I think that's where change actually starts. So we can all do some or all of that. And Jeff, if you John, if you could indulge me 1 minute, there's a question in there about feminism or sexism and racism. And I want to say that's absolutely true. There is such a link between sexism and racism. We know that in Islamophobia as well, it's women, Muslim women, who bear the brunt of the hate and the abuse, mainly because they are women and they are easily identifiable. And, you know, I'll just leave you with one of a Twitter messages that I got once, which epitomizes this, which said, "We don't want Muslim sluts in government."
Yes.
Well, just quickly on that, when I was working on the Christchurch book, it was something that I had to address, because while genuine fascists don't really have very much support in Australia, there's only a tiny number of them. They do have tremendous amount of support online, a surprising amount of support. And how does this ideology, which is so hateful and so nihilistic and offers very little real ideas for how the world might possibly be changed other than through these crazy ideas that somehow violence is a way that is going to transform both you and your meaningless life and the society as a whole, how does it get hearing? Well, and how might we stop it getting hearing? Well, I think the kinds of things we've talked about in this meeting are really important. Standing up, calling out racism, fighting it wherever we can. All of that is absolutely central. But at the end of the day, it was really clear to me when I was reading these people's hateful screeds online that the reason they were getting a hearing is that the people that they were talking to felt that there was no hope in the world. That they felt that the world was on, that with climate change and economic catastrophes, that things were just going to get worse and worse and worse. And in that context, then these nihilistic philosophies of people like the Christchurch perpetrator could get a hearing. So it sounds kind of banal, but I think one of the most important things we can do is convince people it's possible for the world to get better. It's possible for things to become more hopeful, not less hopeful. And, when you think about the world today, it's very rare to actually hear people say that. It's very rare to hear people saying that actually their children will have a better life than they did, or that society will become fairer or more equal or less sexist. And I think if we can start to offer that hope, we cut the legs underneath racists because they've got nothing to say. So I think that that's one thing, it's not an easy thing to say because in some respects the world is in a pretty dark place at the moment. But if we can offer that hope, it makes it much, much harder for the racists.
Thanks, Jeff and Mehreen. One more thing I'd add to that, and that is that to a certain extent, we have done some of this before. We have battled racism with some success. We have battled homophobia with some success. We've battled sexism with some success, not with total success. And of course, there's a reaction to all of that now by the right, by the current government and their allies. But there was a long period. I grew up as a child in Brisbane, where racism was not only common, it was casual, and no one said, "That's racist, please stop that." Now there's still racism, certainly, but it's much more challengeable, much more challenged. So I think we're in a situation where we can fight that fight again and win it. And I just want to conclude the meeting by saying a couple of things, 2 points. The first is about a specific new episode of senseless cruelty that was mentioned earlier, and that's by the attempt by the government to confiscate the phones of those in detention, which will remove a lifeline to families, supporters, lawyers, and the outside world from which many of these people have been cut off physically for 7 years or more. It will certainly cause even more distress and trauma. And Parliament will debate this legislation shortly. We're going to be campaigning against it in any way we can. The chat now should have details of where you can sign a petition against this, and watch this space because we'll be organising further action, other actions as well. Finally, the issues we've been discussing tonight have the most direct impact on the asylum seekers and the refugees who've suffered from the policies Australia has implemented and from Muslims in Australia. But it also matters to the rest of us. If we allow racism, Islamophobia to go unchallenged and for political leaders to profit from it, then we, to paraphrase Abbott, will be changed forever and not for the better. So if you are involved already, please stay involved or even step up further. If not, get in touch and we'll talk to you about what you could do. Once more, thanks so much to our terrific speakers this evening, Mehreen Faruqi and Jeff Sparrow. Thanks to everyone for being with us this evening. Enjoy the rest of it. Good night.
Yeah, thanks, John, as well. And thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.